Good afternoon. My name is David Johnson. I am the Executive Director for the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, CERL. Thank you for joining us for our sixth in our virtual briefing series on the legal dimensions of the Israel-Hamas war. The ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas raises critical questions about the application and the interpretation of the law of armed conflict, LOAC, otherwise known as international legal principles governing the conduct of war. The Center for Ethics and Rule of Law is pleased to host experts in national security, military, strategy, the law of war to discuss these critical topics. CERL is a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute dedicated to preserving and promoting ethics and the rule of law in national security, warfare, and democratic governance. Affiliated with the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania, CERL draws on from the study of law, philosophy, and ethics to answer the difficult questions that arise in times of war and contemporary transnational conflicts. CERL brings together scholars, policymakers, professionals across the legal, military, intelligence, and business sectors to research, analyze, and make policy recommendations that address today's challenging issues such as domestic violent extremism, the use of autonomous weapons, and the protection of civilians in war zones. CERL carries out its mission through conferences, symposia, research and policy papers, briefings, blog publishing, and student projects and other activities. We are pleased to host a summer internship that we will have starting this summer, right after Labor Day. And if you're a law or graduate student interested in this opportunity, please know that we will put a link to apply in the chat. Now for a few housekeeping items before the session begins. Questions will be taken from the audience in approximately the last 20 minutes of the presentation. To ask a question, please enter your question into the Q&A box at any point during the conversation, then click send. The event is recorded and will be posted on CERL's YouTube channel. Now it is my distinct honor to introduce the moderator, Professor Claire Finkelstein, who founded CERL in 2012 and has served as CERL's faculty director since its inception. She is the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. Claire, to you.
Thanks so much, Dave. And just one small correction, actually, the summer internship will start shortly after Memorial Day and run for, I believe, 9 weeks. So any students on the briefing today, we would love to consider your applications. I believe Jen has put the application link in the chat. Thanks to all for being with us today. We have been holding weekly briefings. We are moving to more like an every other week system now. And we're delighted today to be considering the topic of lawfare, a critical topic in the current conflict and in many recent instances of armed conflict around the globe. The topic of lawfare, as we'll discuss, is the idea of using the law to advance the aims of armed conflict, actually using law as a weapon of war. And we have two extraordinary guests to help us talk about that today. John Spencer is an award-winning scholar, professor, author, combat veteran, national security and military analyst, an internationally recognized expert and advisor on urban warfare, military strategy, tactics, and other related topics. Considered one of the world's leading experts on urban warfare, he served as an advisor to the top 4-star general and other senior leaders in the U.S. Army, as part of strategic research groups from the Pentagon to the United States Military Academy. He is the author of 3 books, Understanding Urban Warfare, Connected Soldiers, Life, Leadership, and Soldier Connections in Modern War, and the mini manual for the urban defender. Spencer currently serves as the chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point, and is co-director of the Urban Warfare Project and host of the Urban Warfare Project podcast. He also serves as the chair of Urban Warfare Studies with the Madison Policy Forum, a New York-based think tank. He is a founding member of the International Working Group on Subterranean Warfare, a topic that will be very relevant for our discussion today. Next, Pnina Sharvit Baruch is a senior research fellow and the head of the program on law and national security at the Israel Institute for National Security Studies, the INSS. She is also vice president of the International Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists and a founding member of Foreign Devorah, Women in Foreign Policy and National Security. Pnina retired from the Israel Defense Forces in 2009 with the rank of colonel after 20 years in the International Law Department, heading the department from 2003 on. In this capacity, she was responsible for advising on international law, including the laws of armed conflict. She was in charge of all legal advisors, providing military commanders with legal advice on operational law, including around-the-clock advice during ongoing conflicts. Pnina served as a legal advisor and member of Israel's delegations to the negotiations with the Palestinians and with Syria. After 2009, Pnina taught courses on public international law and on the legal aspects of the Israel-Arab conflict in the law faculty of the Tel Aviv University and at the National Security College. She has published numerous articles on issues relating to these topics. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. Very briefly, to bring us up to date, and we can't do a thorough briefing as we've been doing given the length of time now that has passed, but the conflict has intensified. We continue to see significant casualties. On Monday, 21 soldiers were killed in an attack in central Gaza when a rocket-propelled grenade hit one of the buildings and set off an explosion that led to its collapse. Several more were hit in a nearby tank, killing the tank commander and another Israeli soldier, according to an IDF spokesperson. According to the Hamas-controlled health ministry in Gaza, the number of Palestinians killed has risen to 25,295. We do not, as we have identified on previous briefings, we do not have any way of verifying the accuracy of those numbers. We have pointed out in previous briefings that that number does not include the number of Hamas fighters killed, for example, or the number who are killed because of failed jihadi and Hamas rockets, as well as those killed due to human shielding. Houthi rebel activity has continued in the Red Sea with broad international support for fighting that. However, U.S. and international support to some extent has waned for Israel's efforts in Gaza, and the U.S. has continued to place pressure on Israel to reduce its activities in Gaza to a more targeted, focused offensive. And then finally, we have talked about, as we talked about last time, the International Court of Justice process. Last time we discussed the South African presentation, which our briefing occurred on the very day of the South African presentation of its complaint. The next day, Israel presented its defense. And I'm very glad to be able to start with Pnina and ask her about the Israeli defense, since we did not have a chance to talk about that previously. So why don't we begin there? And in some ways, we might consider the ICJ process and the South African complaint one example of lawfare. Pnina, can you tell us a little bit about the complaint and what we can expect tomorrow, in fact, when the court rules on South Africa's request for provisional measures?
Hi, so first of all, thank you for having me. I think indeed the whole proceeding in the ICJ is a classical case of lawfare because the whole idea is to mark Israel, to put Israel and genocide in the same sentence, and portray Israel as carrying out this crime of crimes, worst crime ever that was, of course, devised by a Jew, Raphael Lemkin, after the Holocaust. So it's also it's almost a personal issue to go against the Jewish state, blaming it of genocide. And I think the proceedings, South Africa presented a lot of examples, distorted some of the facts. The main interesting point in the South African presentation was first that it referred to the occupation of 75. Everything began 75 years ago. That means when Israel was created. So it's clear that the whole problem is the existence of Israel. That's the main issue. South Africa started with apartheid, now it goes to genocide. This is the Hamas idea that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. So, and then portraying Israel's actions without referring at all to the fact that it is fighting against the Hamas. And you just mentioned the soldiers that were killed, that this is not Israel just going inside the Gaza Strip, which is totally under its control, and killing Palestinians. This is a combat zone where the enemy is fighting furiously from its strongholds. This reality didn't appear in the South African presentation. The Israeli presentations, which I thought were very good, I'm a bit biased, many of them are my friends, I think tried to put things into perspective. And first of all, made the basic explanation that genocide and what determines the existence of the crime of genocide is the intention to destroy in whole or in part, and I'm quoting, a particular group as such. And that is what distinguishes genocide from other international law crimes, such as war crimes or crimes against humanity. So you have to show the intent criterion. And Israel explained that there isn't the intent of Israel after what was carried out by the Hamas. The Hamas has an intention to destroy the state of Israel. This is in its charter. And it tried to destroy as many Jews and Israelis as possible on the 7th of October. Israel doesn't have any intent and never had an intent to destroy the Palestinians as such. The whole operation is aimed at destroying the Hamas capabilities, the Hamas as a threat to Israel and to any peaceful resolution of the conflict, by the way, because the Hamas opposes any peaceful resolution of the conflict, but mainly for now, the Hamas as a threat, as a very tangible threat. It has proven to be a huge threat. You have 110,000 Israelis that cannot go home to inside Israel because it's too close to the Gaza Strip. And Israel is doing everything, and they described at length what Israel does to minimize harm to civilians, giving advance warnings, even when it means that that you lose the benefit of surprise, and you make it easy for the enemy to entrench itself. Humanitarian aid, allowing humanitarian aid with humanitarian pauses to allow this humanitarian aid. So leaflets.
Let me interrupt you there and just ask you.
Yeah.
So this bears repeating because in order to be guilty of genocide, number one, a country has to be targeting civilians, right? And so pointing to the casualty count, no matter how high it gets, does not as such make out a case of genocide, I take it. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So how do we know, and let me turn to John here for a minute. John, how do we know that Israel is not targeting civilians, let alone the issue of targeting them as an ethnic group?
Well, there's many ways. One is by their statements and intentions, and what the goals of the war are. Our war is against Hamas. We're putting military capability towards Hamas. And then you can do it by their actions to prevent civilian harm, which is basically the opposite of targeting civilians, such as implementing many of the modern, what we call civilian harm mitigation steps, like encircling a city and giving it 3 weeks to evacuate itself, dropping millions of flyers, making millions of phone calls, texting millions of people to get civilians out of the combat area. Because in a perfect world, you would want an enemy, even if it's an urban area, by itself. So that way, these questions where, unfortunately, what we're seeing is the output of lawfare. Lawfare is the use of the laws to restrict the use of force against you, which is a war crime. but also to what we're seeing is the evolution of one where the perception of the use of force becomes more important than the actual actions in the use of force. Like I can clearly show you that I'm targeting an enemy site, a military target. There are no such thing as Hamas military targets, actually, because it doesn't wear a uniform, it doesn't have military sites, it embeds itself in the civilian population for the purpose of lawfare. But also, there's this evolution in lawfare where there are almost becoming like this court of public opinion common law, which is the output of lawfare on you can't do that. You can't bomb in a densely populated area, period. This is the evolution of what I would call the Western way of warfare being put to the test, to where I follow all rules. I actually follow more rules. The IDF are following more civilian harm mitigation steps than any military has done in the history of warfare.
So that's an interesting. So Pnina, why is it even a consideration, and what are the chances that these provisional measures are going to be granted by the court, and what are some of the provisional measures that South Africa is requesting?
So I don't know what the court will say tomorrow at 2 o'clock Israel time, which is I think 7 o'clock in the morning, I think your time.
Yes.
And I hope that the judges will act and apply the law correctly, but we have to be aware that the ICJ has a strong political component. And also it has a tendency in previous cases when genocide was raised to actually issue interim orders without making any decision and determination about the issue of genocide. So there are such precedents. This is an interim period, interim stage. So what is important to understand that even if they will issue an order, that doesn't mean that the court necessarily thinks that Israel is committing genocide.
Genocide, and that decision won't come for many years.
Yeah, and that will take time. And the South Africa asked for an order to stop Israel from fighting, to stop a complete unilateral ceasefire from Israel's side. It doesn't commit, by the way, the Hamas. The Hamas can continue attacking. Today we had rockets again in the southern part of
Right.
Israel.
So if the court were to issue such a provisional measure, a unilateral ceasefire, would Israel comply?
I really hope that the court won't do that. I really think that there were very good arguments explaining also what I just said. You cannot, in the middle of an armed conflict, impose such a restriction only on one side of the conflict, and the other side that is, in general, doesn't care about the law in any way, and because it is not a member or a party to the conflict, it's not even a state, but it is a de facto governing this area. Can just continue doing what it does. So I don't believe that they will issue such an order. I really don't. What is more plausible maybe is a kind of general order that Israel should comply by its obligations under the convention, which Israel is. So that's
right.
Practically won't be such a problem, and maybe something about improving humanitarian assistance, which Israel is also trying all the time. There are many hurdles, but Israel is not preventing at the moment humanitarian relief and the entry of food and the medical stuff and water. So again, if there's an order on that, that's also something that Israel can comply with, because it is anyway complying with it.
Now the court has no jurisdiction over the question of whether or not Israel is using disproportionate force. And it's important to emphasize this because people do not seem to understand the difference between the complaint before the court, which is about genocide, and the question of whether or not Israel is using disproportionate force. Is it possible that the court will nevertheless make some remarks about the proportionality and whether or not Israel is exceeding permissible levels of proportionality? Pnina, I'll put that to you, and then John, turn to you on proportionality.
Again, it really depends if the court wants to act seriously and responsibly or not, because it is not in their jurisdiction. Their jurisdiction is limited to genocide, so they're not supposed to make comments about other issues of LOAC or IHL. And also, they don't really have the facts beyond the fact that the two states submitted their positions. And I think that if they did have the facts, they would not think that. So again, I hope that the court, I hope that it will not issue anything, but if it does issue some kind of interim orders, I believe that at least the majority of the judges will limit them to the Genocide Convention and to what I said before. That seems to me a more reasonable outcome, if at all.
So John, since the ICJ has no jurisdiction over proportionality, what is the answer for a country using disproportionate force in warfare? There isn't really a court that you can bring a country to consider that question. So how do we enforce judgments of proportionality in war?
Right. Well, I agree with you, although the word proportionality has been taken and historically out of context to what the actual laws of war and the principle of proportionality, proportion of distinction, necessity. It's actually astounding the ignorance of whether it's media or even experts, so-called experts, on what those words actually mean, and that the body, the unfortunate civilian casualty counts in war, to include the fact that 90% of the casualties of modern wars, let's say the last 20 years, 90% have been civilians. That's unfortunate, but we can't create a world in which we de-wed ourselves from the reality of both the laws of war. And there's this unfortunate trend too that has been evolving where humanitarian law or humanitarian rights has been confused with international humanitarian law, or what we would call law of armed conflict. The proportionality assessment is an assessment based on the moment, both in the start of a war and in the actual execution of the war, in what the military objective is. So that's an assessment that people are taking way out of context. Is Israel's actions disproportionate to the military objectives, which are in accordance with the UN Charter of Self-Defense once attacked, disproportionate? Absolutely not. Is it? But there is this court of public opinion, because war is a contest of wills. And in Israel, specifically's history, the world, the international community have stepped in and said, look, I know you're justified in responding to yourself, let's say, as in being attacked by 5 nations at once. I understand enough about war that war is a contest of wills. And the ICJ and mass media all play a role in shaping the world's opinion on what's actually happening, despite the reality of the brutality of war, in which the laws were put in place to constrain the brutality of war. And when you have a country like Israel, who's fighting not a battle, which people inappropriately try to use moral equivalency to previous battles, Israel's not fighting a battle in which you can assess proportionality. Israel's fighting a war with multiple battles against an existential threat of a size and of a complexity that no military has faced in a modern era.
So let's talk some more about that now. One of the other extraordinary developments in the last 2 weeks is the discovery of the extent of the tunnel system that really surpassed previous estimates. Some of the prior estimates talked about 300 miles of tunnels. Now they're talking about 450 miles of tunnels, and with different layers of tunnels in the same in the same layers, or I don't know how to describe that, so that you have actually in below a certain segment of Earth, different layers of tunnels. The extent of it is really breathtaking. Briefly on the proportionality issue, it's extremely difficult to attack members of Hamas when they're hiding in tunnels. First of all, the weaponry that they need to blow up tunnels is much greater than if they were above ground, and that mounts the civilian casualties significantly. The irony is that, let's remind our listeners that the concept of proportionality requires military advantage to be demonstrated per civilian casualty, right? So the more civilian casualties you have, the more military advantage you need to demonstrate to justify those civilian casualties. So the irony is, by making themselves so difficult to kill, in effect, that makes it more difficult for Israel to justify their offensive. Can you comment on that, John?
Sure, absolutely. And I think that's a great point to continue to highlight, that I think is missed in many of the assessments of whether a precision guided munition is used, or whether it's a 500-pound versus a 2,000-pound bomb, versus what depth is the military value at. So there's many firsts here that are really causing people who actually know the law to struggle with that question of trying to judge another military's. Okay, you say that that's of a high military value, but I think there's another way. That's, again, where you wed yourself from reality, where Hamas not only has tunnels, which are not new, right? And I agree, all the assessments were wrong on the depth of tunnels, as in the complexity, the depth, the construction, going from 15 feet down to 200 plus feet, where no military bomb can hit into the ground. There's some uniqueness there. There are others like North Korea, China, who have very vast tunnel complexes, but none of them built them purposely underneath the civilian sites so that you can't get to them, not just through your weapons technology, but you can't get to them without killing or destroying urban terrain or civilian casualties, although you've taken every step feasible and historically to evacuate civilians. Right. If we have a military value underground, that has to account, but you also have to account for the existential threat to the military who's making that assessment. The fact that the rockets aren't discussed as well, which are also underground, that there were 2,000 rockets launched at Israel civilian sites on day one, and there have been 8,000 plus rockets launched almost every day of the war. So if somebody's talking about, okay, what's the military advantage you gain from conducting that strike, you have to account for not just what's being struck in the military value, let's say of a battalion commander, division commander, a certain number of troops, is that they're organizing the launching of rockets in real time. They're holding the hostages, which are time sensitive. This is the problem with the revisionist history of what is military value in a war.
Right. So you go ahead, Pnina.
If I can add also, another problem is also making the estimation of what would be the collateral damage, because the problem with the tunnels, they go under all the civilian infrastructure, and they also booby-trapped. And they are aimed also that if the Hamas prepared for this attack, okay? When it launched its October 7th attack on Israel, it knew that Israel, the IDF, will enter. So it's prepared everything like a kind of huge trap, okay, for soldiers. So everything is also booby-trapped. And everything is, so when you blow up part of the tunnel, first of all, other parts collapse, and then you have houses that collapse that you can't even know exactly where exactly what will collapse. Secondly, things explode. So you have, beyond the fact that the infrastructure itself becomes a military objective, it's a lawful military target because it's used for military purposes, but the collateral harm is not necessarily expected. So I agree that both. So that's one thing that you don't know. And again, when doing the balancing, yes, it is relevant to judge the military advantage, as you said, and the expected collateral harm. And the military advantage needs to take into account what level of threat this infrastructure is causing. And the level of threat is huge. As we can see, we are not managing over 100 days, 3.5 months. The Hamas is still holding strong, killing many soldiers, still firing rockets. So this is a huge, formidable enemy, and we are operating in its terrain that it has fortified. And the soldiers coming out from Gaza, I spoke to some soldiers that came out and reservists. They say every house we go into, we find weapons, we find an entry to a tunnel, we find rockets. It's everything has, they used the whole civilian infrastructure as their military base. So this has to be understood when evaluating Israel's response.
Right. And soldiers that we spoke to when we were in Israel described finding grenades under children's beds, weapons caches in kindergartens, and of course tunnel entrances in schools, kindergartens, refugee camps, and hospitals. So this tunnel system, and John, you've recently written a marvelous article about this, is really a lawfare setup because of the intentional placement of these tunnels underneath civilian infrastructure. It is designed, they are designed to shelter members of Hamas underneath the civilian population, thus creating the situation that they are shielding, literally shielding themselves from destruction by using civilian population. So how do we assess what Israel's right to self-defense extends to under those circumstances? And also, can you talk, you've actually been in one of these tunnels. Can you talk about what they're like and how one fights an enemy using such tunnels?
Yeah, so the last part is very hard since it's never been done before. There's never been a case where ISIS used tunnels, Al-Qaeda used tunnels, the Taliban used the caves of Afghanistan that were left behind. It's not new, but this fact that they literally built them and designed them to be underneath the urban areas, underneath the civilian sites, and uniquely, again, underneath what certain objects and sites which have a special layer of protection. I know that we hopefully will get to talk to about, like hospitals, schools, mosques, for the sole purpose of surviving, where tunnels are usually used in support of your military objective. Hamas just wants to survive Israel's counterattack so that it gains power to achieve its ultimate written down goal of destroying Israel and all Jews. The uniqueness to how do you do this? And yes, last month I went to the biggest one that they've found, which is just how it was done. But right outside the Erez humanitarian interests, Israel found a massive invasion tunnel that was very similar to the North Korean invasion tunnel that I've been in as well. Just the sheer millions of dollars it would take to construct that one tunnel that was over 4 kilometers, so 2 miles long, stretching back into Gaza, into the urban areas, again, popping out in homes and in schools and other places. They just found last week another 2 kilometer, again, another mile. And I think it's really hard to comprehend the scale, but also the billions of dollars that were invested by Hamas, stolen from the people, the humanitarian aid and other resources that were sent to help the Palestinian people of Gaza were invested into this terror cities underneath the cities. How do you fight it? Well, so I think it's a really good example, again, of judging the actions required to take that away from Hamas, to take that military capability to harm Israel away from them. You have to go in and clear house to house, tunnel to tunnel, find the tunnels, remove the rockets, destroy the tunnels, as many as you can, in order to remove that existential threat to Israel on its border.
Right. One of the challenges, of course, with the aid, and Israel talked about this extensively, is that Hamas needs gas to run its tunnel system, right, for energy. Israel had very much resisted allowing gasoline through the checkpoints, and yet the hospitals needed gas to function and to run their generators. So this was a really difficult dilemma. It's my understanding, Pina, that when Israel finally did relent and allow gasoline in, that Hamas then started stockpiling that gas, and that the IDF feels that the decision to allow gasoline through delayed and set back the war effort. What is your understanding on that?
Yes, yes, the Hamas already in the beginning they stole fuel from UNRWA, where it was meant for the benefit of the civilian population, and somebody from UNRWA put it on a tweet and immediately deleted it after a while. I hope they're still alive because I'm not supposed to say such things about the Hamas. But yes, that was a big dilemma, and Israel tried to prevent the entry of fuel. Because it knew it will give the Hamas the ability to continue the fighting, and it was one of the points that put pressure on the Hamas to agree to the first hostages for the deal of the hostages was the fact that they were short on supplies. But now there's a lot of pressure on Israel to enable the introduction also of fuel because it's necessary for the hospitals, it's necessary for the desalination projects. And the problem is that once it goes in, and this is again, it attests to the fact that Hamas is still very much in control. The Hamas takes control of whatever goes in. First of all, it supplies itself and doesn't really care about the civilians. It's even on the opposite. The harder the situation is for the Palestinians, the Hamas has an interest. I'm sorry, it sounds, but it has an interest that there will be a humanitarian crisis, that there will be civilian casualties, that there will be hardship, because eventually that puts the pressure on Israel to stop fighting for ceasefire. It puts the pressure on Israel's allies not to assist it. So this is the tactic. It's a win-win for them. I mean, on the one hand, they are either they receive, if we do enter the stuff, or if we do avoid attacking because civilians might get harmed, so they retain their capabilities and they can continue fighting and holding on to the control of the Gaza Strip. And if we do try to prevent introduction of fuel, for example, or attack a certain place that they could cause civilians in order to harm their military capabilities, then immediately they turn it against Israel, and the world immediately follows their lead and starts blaming Israel of war crimes and even of genocide.
So how should Israel balance that? Because Israel does have an obligation under international law to allow aid into the civilian population. But when they know that Hamas is going to be stealing that aid and stockpiling it, I mean, the trouble is it doesn't relieve them of the obligation to try to allow the aid in and to allow it to reach the civilian population.
Legally, the law does allow a country to condition the introduction of humanitarian relief on putting conditions to a certain that it doesn't get into the hands of the enemy forces.
Yes.
And the humanitarian relief that you are again legally obligated to introduce is very limited to what is needed for the survival of the civilians. So what is expected from Israel is much more than what the law requires. But here we enter into the realm of legitimacy, and so it's not that what the law, the IHL says, it's what is considered legitimate or not, and Israel has a lot of pressure on it. I think it's Israel doesn't want a humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. I think it's against its interest also on a moral level, on a legal level, and also we don't want that to be our responsibility eventually if there's something like that there. So we have other reasons, but also it's the issue of legitimacy, and it goes beyond the letter of the law.
John, let's talk now about the tunnel system in Lebanon, because Gaza is not the only place there is a tunnel system. Some of our viewers may be surprised to learn this. I was surprised to learn it when I was in Israel, the extent of the tunnel system in Lebanon, but you've told me that these tunnels are actually rather different. Can you tell us something about that?
Sure. While the estimates for what was in Gaza, called the Gaza Metro or Lower Gaza, were wrong. It's much greater than the world, Israel, everybody had believed. In southern Lebanon, you're talking about a completely different environment, a completely different enemy force. It's called really the land of tunnels, because it's not unique for militaries And Hamas is a terrorist organization with a military. Hezbollah is more like a military with 100,000 rockets believed, 100,000 soldiers. But they've also spent decades building a vast tunnel complex underground in southern Lebanon, hundreds and hundreds of miles, but for military purposes. And to include more analogous to North Koreans, deep buried military targets, rocket launching sites, massive rockets launching sites underground for defensive capabilities, right? To be able to survive a bigger military strike against you, but also have offensive capability. Although I have been in Hezbollah tunnels in northern Israel, which were basically invasion tunnels, which meant to allow them to pop out, grab IDF soldiers, and pull them back into Lebanon. The expanse of the Hezbollah tunnels is vast, but it's very unique, the fact that that's not new either, although it would be a significant challenge for the IDF because of that tunnels, because tunnels are meant to protect you, to make you stronger, survive. Hamas has created a new architecture where it has built cities underneath cities to restrict the use of force. And if they survive this war, they just created a new architecture, like Pnina said, for all of the terrorists of the world to do the same.
So does this suggest that Israel ought to anticipate another October 7th in the north from Hezbollah?
Of course, and everything that Hezbollah has done since October 7th would warrant a full, legitimate war of self-defense by the IDF. 100,000 Israeli citizens have had to move out of their homes because of the actions of Hezbollah. But yes, if Hamas survives after conducting October 7th, that would lead to many more attempts at an October 7th, to include by Hezbollah in the north and other people around the world. I mean, it's just like when the rise of terrorism in the 70s, when airplanes were being captured and held hostage, it spread rapidly until something was developed, until it wasn't no longer an advantage. That's the problem with calling for a ceasefire and Hamas surviving this war, is that October 7th will be a victory for Hamas and frankly for its backers in Iran.
Yeah, if I can add, I think
Go ahead,
it's a very
please.
important point, because I think what we need to understand is that if the Hamas is victorious, and to be victorious, all it has to do is to survive this, after what it did, to stay in control. That means that Israel's deterrence is gone. And we have these other enemies that are, again, also their aim is to destroy the state of Israel. This is not about ending the occupation of the 1967 occupation, if anybody is confused about that. It's about ending Israel and its existence. And they're waiting for that. And I think that would be a very, very dangerous message also for Hezbollah to initiate. Hezbollah also has beyond the tunnels, it's the rockets. They have sophisticated rockets that can hit strategic assets in Israel, deep into Israel, Tel Aviv. These are not rockets that Israel has the capability to thwart by its existing defensive capabilities.
So these are not rockets that Iron Dome can take out.
No, not enough.
Because they're longer range,
and they're more sophisticated, and so this is a huge threat. And it's a part of a whole axis that Iran is behind. And we have the Houthis that are attacking from the south. They've tried to attack Eilat a few times, and they're attacking ships and shipmen, and threatening anyone trying to access Israeli ports. So we have that also from Yemen. And by the way, talking about tunnels, there are also all the time, there's a lot of fear in the Israeli villages and towns close to the Green Line, to the 1967 line, that there are attempts of tunnels coming from the West Bank.
From the West Bank as well.
Towns in the West Bank into villages in Israel. So that's another additional threat. That's why this war doesn't resemble anything anything we've had before. This is on all fronts, and it is about the existence of Israel. It's just like you try to imagine if the US was attacked from Canada and Mexico by enemies that are firing rockets and penetrating and murdering and kidnapping American civilians. That's what we are facing. This is not fighting
And add to
ISIS.
that the Russians in Alaska.
Yeah. This is not about the US and coalition forces fighting ISIS far away from home. It's a vicious
Right.
enemy, but it's not
Right.
a direct threat.
Let's add a discussion of some other forms of lawfare. Now, John, you've recently been writing about hospitals. It's important to understand, and we've talked about this before on this briefing, that hospitals normally in warfare have protected status. So it is against the laws of war to attack a hospital. However, hospitals lose that protected status when one side is using hospitals to stage military operations, store weapons, and so forth, which the IDF has revealed Hamas to be doing in the current conflict. Can you elaborate a little bit on the situation with hospitals in the current conflict and how we should think of that under the umbrella term of lawfare?
Sure. I think the hospitals again is another urban legend of urban warfare that's trying to be used against Israel's war and against Hamas, is that you can't touch a hospital. Now, while there are many layers of laws actually about hospitals as protected objects and protected sites, also the staff as non-combatants and the wounded, even if they're wounded soldiers, all have layers of protection under the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law. But it's also very clear in the laws, if a combatant is using the protection of such a site, whether it's a hospital or a mosque, or let's keep on hospitals, that site can lose its protections, especially if depending on what the enemy is doing, not just using it for storing equipment, but they're using it for a command center. They're using it actually to attack from, which Israel has demonstrated. But in this context where Israel has been criticized for its operations against hospitals that Hamas is using, it hasn't attacked hospitals. And from a urban warfare history perspective, even modern history, it isn't true that that's unique, that hospitals become a very focal point because of combatants like Hamas, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, name the bad guy, will use hospitals very specifically because they know they're so sensitive, as in you have to be very careful about the operation. But in the Battle of Mosul in 2017, ISIS was using hospitals to attack from, as in shooting out of the hospital. Coalition forces did airstrikes against the hospitals, armored division attacks against hospitals, all things that Israel hasn't done, even though the protection statuses of the hospitals were lost when Hamas was using them, to include coming out of a hospital, firing RPG, going back into the hospital. Israel has moved to and secured hospitals, which there is no law against that, mainly for its safety. But even in the 2004 Battle of Fallujah, which in the first battle, the U.S. military lost the battle because of the hospital, because Al Jazeera was in the hospital giving out information about disproportionate civilian casualties and harm to children, and so much so that it, in this court of public opinion, said that the force was disproportionate and the battle was stopped. So on the second Battle of Fallujah, 6 months later, the hospital was identified as one of the first targets, first objectives, and there was a massive firefight at the hospital to secure it so it could continue to function as a protected site, but also not be used like terrorists do as a propaganda tool against the military. But it's very unique, the fact that it's become this urban legend that they're untouchable. If there was any site, it doesn't matter what it is, cemetery, hospital, whatever, that no matter what the enemy was doing inside of it, you couldn't touch it, it would lead to really bad outcomes in the actual persecution of wars by those who want to use lawfare.
Now, if a hospital loses its protected status because of these military activities and stagings on the part of the enemy, there's still an obligation to apply proportionality general proportionality considerations to the situation on the ground. And I take it at that point it becomes the same as any other civilian site in terms of the assessment of proportionality. Or would you say that the calculation is different?
I mean, this is where these calculations become very complex in the value, but there's always going to be a sensitivity. And this is where Israel has shown, even not in hospitals, where it has made the call not to strike based on those considerations beyond even those law required assessments. But yes, even in a hospital, because it has so many layers of protection, not just the site, but the staff, the wounded, all of this, that consideration would be very unique. And to strike, again, to strike a hospital is a lot different than doing an operation to secure a hospital. There's such a vast difference. But yes, if you were going to strike a hospital, that consideration of proportionality, necessity, distinction, all those would be extra sensitive.
Right. Now, go ahead, Pina.
Just to add, I think just one point, hospitals do have a special protection that it goes beyond the other kinds of objects, but what it means is that you need to give a special warning
That's right.
to the enemy to stop using the hospital for its military purposes. But if it continues, then it becomes a legitimate target. And as was said, while it could be a legitimate target, and then of course the issue of proportionality would enter, and it would be complex because there are many civilians there, and the staff, and people getting a treatment, and people hiding in the hospital. But Israel didn't actually do that. So it didn't target hospitals. All the operations that were conducted were very limited operations of entering with the forces, even warning the doctors in advance, enabling usually that the hospital can continue to operate in part of it, or if it's not possible in smaller hospitals, allowing for an organized evacuation of the hospital. So these are military operations that are not an attack on the hospital. So the considerations are again of military necessity and balancing it with humanitarian needs, and doing it in a way that would spare the civilians and minimize harm to civilians. But it is not a direct attack against an objective like in a classical case of targeting, for example, from the air.
So we need to let the Q&A in. I have one very quick last topic, though, that I'm desperate to cover before we do that, which is the topic of journalists. We hear a lot about the number of journalists that are dying in this conflict. And that's a little bit of a different case because journalists don't have the kind of protection that hospitals do. It is more by convention. They are ordinary civilians, and of course proportionality considerations apply, but by convention it is understood that we want to try to protect journalists. They are civilians, but with a kind of special status. John, can you tell us anything about, human shielding around press status? Because Hamas, of course, uses the label of press status to, increase sympathy to some extent for civilians killed, and uses it to some extent falsely. Though I don't doubt that there are large numbers of journalists who are actually in harm's way and being killed in the current conflict.
Yeah, I'll leave it to Pina to talk about the actual law, but the fact there is no additional layer of protection for media, although there is almost like a customary aspect to that. But this is, again, the danger of lawfare is when people believe it's actual law, and that so much so that the enemy actually believes so. And one of the examples, it's not comical, but there's a guy named Mr. Fafo in Gaza that I've seen, and he'll wear press credentials. And I think from a perspective that the enemy believes that it's a special layer of protection. You're either a combatant or you're a non-combatant engaged in the hostilities. And if you're with any journalist who's embedded within a military force is taking on ownership and agency of themselves, although they're not engaging. If they are, like flying a drone towards a military force, they could be perceived as hostile intent or engaging in the hostilities. So it's a dangerous place. But I agree that all civilians, to target any civilian is unlawful, but that there's almost this, again, another urban legend is that they're untouchables and they have this beacon of protection around them. Like, no, if you're standing next to somebody who's engaged in a hostile activity, it doesn't matter who you are, you are at risk, and you're accepting a lot of risk in of yourself.
Pnina, do you want to comment on journalists in
I
Gaza?
think that's the right analysis. They are civilians, unless they are engaged, directly participating in hostilities, and so they weigh in the proportionality. But unlike civilians, many times that do try to avoid the harm, unless sometimes the Hamas uses them as the shields. We've had cases where they send civilians, children and women mainly, towards the forces, yes, and fired from behind, yes. So we've had also those cases, but generally the civilians would try to avoid, and the journalists actually are there alongside the fighters of the other side. So they do expose themselves to the danger. They still have to be calculated into the proportionality, but it is, of course, it doesn't mean that you will not be able to fire at someone that is firing towards you or firing a rocket just because there's a journalist nearby. And we also have to remember that all you have to do to be a journalist in the Gaza Strip is to put a vest with the word press on
That
it.
says press on.
Necessarily. So there's a big question of who is a journalist. So it's not.
Right. That's a question in the US too, of course, under First Amendment law. We have a few questions. I'm going to run by you. Let me know if you want to answer them. Michael says, I'm curious about the legal status of Hamas fighters captured. Should Israel choose to hold them inside Gaza? What legal rights do they have, and what rights does Israel have regarding their imprisonment? Pnina, do you want to take that?
So since Hamas is not a state that has its armed forces that are recognized, and this is not an international armed conflict, they are a non-state actor, and therefore the people fighting on behalf of the Hamas are unlawful combatants, and they can be detained and arrested, and they don't have the right POW status. Now you can detain them inside the territory, but if it endangers them, or if it endangers the soldiers, or if there's a problem operationally to hold them inside the territory, it is okay to take them also outside to Israel. And then to hold them in Israel. In Israel, they are held also under a law, an Israeli law, that is called the Unlawful Combatants Law, which is a kind of administrative detention with giving them conditions that are similar to POWs, to prisoners of war, but again, they don't have the right to be prisoners of war. But there is a review process, a judge that overviews the order of incarceration. So there is a process how to hold them also within the country.
And Pnina, of course, it's worth pointing out that the fact that they're not technical POWs doesn't mean that they don't have rights under the Geneva Conventions.
Yes.
And this is a topic that's...
detention, the laws, by the way, the administrative detention law and also the law of unlawful combatants give them the conditions that are equivalent in many regards to those of POW, of prisoners of war. They don't have the right held by rank and all other specifics that are relevant just when they are soldiers, but they do have rights and the conditions of internment that are regulated by the law. Much more than the hostages are getting in Gaza, that's for sure.
2 briefings from now, we will actually be addressing the question of detainees in the war on Gaza. So stay tuned for more on that. There are some troublesome reports that have come out about Israel's treatment of detainees, and we're going to be trying to address that as clearly and forthrightly as we can. Comment from Jim Moss: assume a home invasion coupled with horrendous torture and killing of family members. Police surround the home and perpetrators leave with hostages. He says, I gather police would not shoot at perpetrators knowing the hostages will be killed, and instead would refrain and trust that later procedures would bring perpetrators to justice. Would that suggest that after massive civilian casualties, at some point the IDF should withdraw and rely instead on special forces actions in the future? John?
Yeah, so I'll take on one. It's the wrong framework to view a war in a civil lens. So any use of police force, and when the actual both the criminal has a many civil protections, you can't then apply that to a war setting. You have to apply the law of armed conflict with all its intricacies. The last bit, though, is the biggest another big urban myth again to this war is people misapplying counterinsurgency and counterterror operations against what Israel is actually facing, which is a war against an enemy-held city in which their hostages are being held inhumanely in tunnels in that city. For special forces operation, there's no special forces, none in the world, who could conduct the operation. As a matter of fact, there's no way to do it other than the way Israel is doing it. There is a myth that you can do it with not a lot of. So I've heard this special operations fallacy. It's called the vampire fallacy, that you can just have special operations swoop in, kill your bad guys, get your hostages, get out of there. That's never been done in the history. It's counterfactual to the actual context of war. When you have a non-permissible environment where everything is a threat, versus we're in special forces, like let's say in Osama bin Laden laid, where they have intelligence on a one place. They know where the strike is. Everything else is pretty much permissible. You can get in, you can get out. That's not what war is. That's, again, counterterrorism operation. And that's such a big myth that I've seen propagated by some people that I view as pretty smart. But the idea that you could do that in this context with the rockets, with 30,000 Hamas fighters estimated, the tunnels, that you could send special forces to do anything, is just a myth.
And again, taking into account the existential threat.
If we could, we would release the hostages with special forces, and we haven't succeeded in releasing, except one in the beginning that was a bit of a special case. We didn't manage, unfortunately, to release any hostage with our special forces. This is Hamas-controlled land. This is the Hamas country. It's not a small terrorist organization that took some hostages and is hiding somewhere. They are the de facto government of the Gaza Strip for the last, since 2007, and they control everything there. So this is fighting a war against a very fierce enemy that has its own army. It's not at all a criminal kind of bandits that we can use special forces, unfortunately.
We're running out of time, but there's one last question that is, I think, really important to ask here that Aaron Landgarten has asked, which is, he says, regarding the ratio of civilian to combatant fatalities, even though the UN states that for modern warfare that ratio is 9-1, and the IDF states that in Gaza the ratio is much lower, i.e. 2-1, claims have been made that in Mosul and possibly Fallujah the ratio was much lower still, and that proves that the IDF is being disproportionate even with the 2-1 number. Even if true, can one make an extrapolation from Mosul to Gaza, considering factors like the number of terrorists, the existence and type of tunnels, and the extent of defensive preparations made by the different terrorists? John, you want to address that?
Sure. One thing, there's three types of lies: damn lies, and statistics. So somebody tries to use statistics to make a moral equivalency that is actually counterfactual to the actual numbers, right? The 9-1 is really the UN statement that 90% of casualties of modern wars are civilians. So let's discount that one. The Battle of Mosul, there were 3,000 to 5,000 ISIS fighters, and it took 100,000 Iraqi security forces, and they killed 10,000 estimated civilians. So that's where the 2-1, although it's actually less than that, it's more than that. 2-1 comes in, but it's, again, these numbers aren't what matters, but I'll play the numbers if somebody wants to. But even in that war, nobody knows how many civilians died. So here's the uniqueness to this war, is that I've never seen a war in the history of wars in which you can calculate the civilian casualties on a daily rate down to the single digit. Just not possible. Matter of fact, in that Battle of Mosul, a year later, the Iraqi officials were saying, we don't know. estimate 10,000. Some people are like the mayor's saying 40,000, because of how hard it is to actually know. But that aside, the Battle of Mosul was against 3,000 fighters in one city. Again, the number being used against Israel is 7 cities. So let's take 7 Mosuls and 7 times the amount of fighters, and then do some calculations. But again, that's not how proportionality works. So it's not like you can take the effect, because we can go back to World War II and talk about 100,000 killed in a single day in the bombing of Tokyo. That's not how the estimate of proportionality works. So no, it doesn't show disproportionality, even though that statistic isn't right and doesn't. But that is some type of moral equivalency that people want to make, miscomparing the war. Again, nobody's ever faced, and since World War II, even then, what IDF faced on scale, complexity, all of that. It's fighting in 7 cities against 30,000 fighters that are buried underground.
And if I can add,
Go
if I may,
ahead, Pina. I'll give you the last word on this, and
okay,
then
so
we are
because
over time.
I've read a few times about this fact that the U.S. had a policy at one stage of 0 civilian casualties, or very low numbers of, and I think people are mixing, first of all, policy and law. You can always decide on a policy that goes beyond what the law requires, but again, the difference is the threat. The U.S. was not facing an enemy that was at its borders firing rockets towards New York. Okay. When that happens, and when you have enemies entering inside, I don't know, Florida, and kidnapping people and murdering them, and firing rockets, and the enemy is entrenched within civilian places using civilians as shields, I assure you that the U.S. would not apply a 0 civilian casualty as a policy. So comparisons are dangerous when they disregard that this is and it's difficult for countries in the West and in the US that haven't faced an existential threat to maybe comprehend, but we are afraid for our lives. Okay, we are fighting for our lives, and this is and in this case we still have to apply the law. But the laws of armed conflict understand that. That's why everything is proportionality. It takes into account the level of the threat, what we are facing, and these comparisons have to be made very carefully.
Thank you to both of you for an extraordinary conversation. You're both so extremely knowledgeable. It's very, very helpful to talk to you. I hope that you'll both come back on a future briefing. We will be talking next briefing about the use of sexual assault in war, a very difficult topic. We'll have extraordinary experts to discuss that. I hope you'll all join us for that briefing. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Yes, I echo what Professor Finkelstein has just said. Thank you for joining us. The event recording will be available on Searle's YouTube channel shortly. And as Professor Finkelstein alluded to, our next presentation will be on February 15th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, featuring a conversation with Koches Levy, the chair of the Civil Commission on the October 7th crimes by Hamas against women and children, and Professor Diane Orent-Licker of American University Washington College of Law on the topic of sexual violence in war. Stay tuned for information about our next briefing, and by joining Searle's mailing list, and which our link will be available on the chat, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.